Magnus Carlsen has been dominating the chess world recently, particularly at the time controls of Rapid and Blitz. And Blitz, really in particular, he just has been dominating all of the top players. Recently, he played in the championship of the AIM Chess Rapid event. His opponent was world top 10 player Wesley So, and we're going to go over one of those games. Wesley So had the white pieces in this game. Magnus Carlsen had the black pieces. And this is a good example of two elite players playing at the top of their game. Wesley begins with c4, the English opening. Magnus plays knight to f6, knight c3, and then e5. Basically a main line English. Magnus playing e5, the main theoretical move. Knight to f3, knight to c6. We have 4 knights developed, and g3. Basically, when you play the English opening like this, you play the bishop to g2, develop it on the long diagonal. Long diagonal. And you're playing it like a Sicilian dragon with colors reversed, basically. So d5, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop to g2, putting the bishop on that very powerful diagonal, aiming all the way across the board, even to b7. And now Magnus plays knight to f6, a very uncommon move. I think it's the 5th most common move in this position, the main move being knight to b6. But knight to f6, he's trying to put a little oomph behind this e-pawn. Maybe he'll try to gain some space with e4 later. Wesley So castles, and now h6 was played. The idea is that after black plays e4, hitting this knight, now the knight can't go to g5 to pile up on this pawn. It would force the knight to h4 or e1. Neither one is a very good square. h4 was really a bad square. One interesting alternative is bishop to e7, but then white can play b4 immediately. Looks like he's hanging a pawn, but after bishop takes, knight can take e5. And when the knight takes the knight, queen to a4 check. Hits the queen and the bishop, and when you bring the knight back to block and defend the bishop, bishop takes c6 check. Pawn takes bishop, queen takes b4, and white is just clearly better, maybe even winning here. Magnus plays h6 to keep the knight out of g5. a3 is played. If you play b4 here, then e4. a3, bishop to d6 to defend the e-pawn. b4, castles, and d3. Another thematic move. It keeps the e4 square under control if Magnus ever wants to try to gain space there. Rook to e8 puts a little more oomph behind that pawn. Also, he might be able to tuck the bishop back to f8. Bishop to b2. Now both bishops are on the long diagonals. This bishop aims at g7 and also at this e5 pawn. a6 to keep Wesley So from playing b5 and kicking this c6 knight away from the defense of the e5 pawn. Rook to c1, thematic idea, placing the rook on the half-open c-file. Bishop to e6, and now knight to a4. This c5 square is very sensitive for black, because he can't play b6 because then his c6 knight would hang. So there's really no way to stop the white knight landing on the c5 square. So Magnus plays queen to d7. The idea is he wants to play the bishop to h3 and trade off this nice g2 bishop and reduce Wesley So's power in that way. The knight goes to c5, hitting the queen at d7, bishop at e6. Basically, Magnus has to take the knight. Strategically, it's a disaster if he doesn't. So he takes the knight. Rook takes c5. The pawn on e5 is attacked 3 times, by the way. Bishop to h3. White could play queen to b3 here and just double on the c-file. But instead, he goes ahead and takes the bishop on h3. Now, that invites the queen to the h3 square near white's king, and that could be dangerous, but at the moment, it doesn't look like black has any other pieces to back up that queen. Bishop takes e5 was played again. Queen to b3 is perfectly good. Bishop takes e5. And here, Magnus plays knight to d7, which hits the bishop and the rook. However, computers show us a very powerful idea, and that is the move knight to g4. Obviously, he's hitting the bishop at e5 in 3 directions, but also he's 1 move away from delivering mate on h2, which is only defended by the knight at f3. So if he can distract that knight, white would be in big trouble. So the bishop has to move, or it's lost. Then the computers show us that knight to d8 is the powerful idea. The knight is threatening to go to e6, where it would hit the rook on the way, then to g5, threatening to remove that knight on f3, and white would be in a great deal of trouble in that position. Magnus plays the knight to d7, hitting the rook and the bishop. Bishop takes c7. So Wesley So is grabbing 2 pawns. He knows he's going to give up the exchange, so you'd have even material, but unbalanced material. Rook to c8, the bishop moves, and now the knight takes the c5 rook. Pawn takes. So Carlsen has the exchange, a rook for a minor piece. Wesley So has 2 pawns, which again, it's even material, but very unbalanced. And if Wesley So can get these central pawns moving, it could really wipe Magnus off of the board. So Magnus is going to have to find a way to neutralize those pawns and activate his extra rook. The queen goes to e6, attacks e2, e3 to defend that pawn. Now knight to e7, it attacks the c5 pawn, but he also wants to make sure he blockades these pawns on light squares. Here, if white goes d4, then knight to d5. It hits the bishop, and after a move like b6, Magnus would begin to chip away at the center, and his extra rook would begin to find open lines. So instead of playing d4, knight to d4 is played. Hits the queen, queen goes to d5, and now bishop to d6. Using this pawn at c5 to anchor the bishop at d6, but it is temporary because of this next move, b6, trying to undermine that bishop and nibble on that c-pawn. Bishop takes e7 is played by Wesley So. Now here, if rook to e7, which seems like the natural move, then c6, and this pawn is defended by the knight on d4, and actually white's probably slightly better here. This knight, defended by the pawn at e3, is very, very hard for black to deal with. Very hard. So instead, Magnus goes ahead and takes on c5. That's the idea. Here, white had this idea of queen to g4, and if obviously you can't play rook takes e7 because the queen would take the rook, and if pawn takes knight, bishop f6 threatens mate, and after g6, queen d4, bishop d4, and this would be just a completely equal endgame, it looks like. But instead, he goes ahead and plays bishop takes pawn, rook takes c5, and now queen to a4, hits the rook at e8. Now rook e to c8 was played. Rook to a8, defending the a6 pawn, was also a good idea, but he gives up the pawn. Wesley So grabs it. And now rook to c1 with very serious threats. Obviously, you can't take the rook because then that's actually checkmate because this queen covers the escape square. So Wesley So plays h4 to try to give his king some room to run if it needs to later. Now here, Magnus played king to h7, but he had a really powerful shot here. Rook takes f1 check would have been crushing. After king f1, rook to c1, forcing king to e2. Then queen to h5 check, and of f3, queen to d5, threatening queen to a2, which would be threatening a mate in 2. King to d2, then queen to c5. And the threat of queen to c3 check would decide the game. After king to h7, Wesley So plays queen to a4. Queen to b5, threatening or offering the exchange of queens was a reasonable alternative. But now rook to f1 check, king f1, rook to c1 check, king to e2. And in this position, Magnus has one move to win the game. Everything else is at least equal for white, or maybe even better for white. If he plays the earlier move of queen to h5 check, then just knight to f3 works fine. There's no check on c2 because the queen controls that square, and white would be holding this endgame. The move to win for black is queen to h1, and that is the move Magnus plays. Obviously, he's coming in with all sorts of threats against the king at e2. Queen goes to b3 to try to keep the c2 square under control. It attacks f7, but that's not really a main concern at the moment. Rook to e1 check, king to d2, and now rook to b1, attacking the queen. If the queen moves to a4, then queen to e1 check, king c2, queen to c1 is checkmate. So he plays the move queen to c2. and that keeps the c1 square under control. There's just one problem. Queen to e1 is checkmate, and Magnus delivered checkmate and won the AIM Chess Rapid Championship. I hope you enjoyed this game from the great Magnus Carlsen. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.